Hello, and welcome back to the Data Mind. I'm Kaylee Garbazeski, analyst turned advisor, and we're here to talk about all things analytics. Today, we are talking to Dara Wilson about going from level 0 to 1 in your organization with analytics.
This is the Data Mind.
Welcome, Dara.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. So I'm really excited because Dara, as those of you who have been following along, is our second female guest. And that's exciting to me because our audience right now is about 81% male. And I'm hoping to kind of change that a little bit and show the world that there's some real female powerhouses out there in the analytics space. And Dara is one of them. She's been a data analytics professional for about 6 years now and has been leading and executing analytics initiatives in industries ranging from healthcare to utilities to software. And her focus is really turning raw data into useful insights that everyone can use. So she's doing that by empowering a toolbox of data visualization, data engineering, strategy definition, and user empowerment. And I really love that background, and I'm excited to dig into this with her because it's that jack of all trades, understanding all of those spaces is really what makes the analytics role so unique, in my opinion. Dara is currently based out of Portland, Oregon, where she lives with her partner, Ryan, their puppy, Robert, and their cat, Richard. So lots of R's in the Dara world. And she also, I think it bears mentioning, has her master's in public health, which is pretty cool. And I'm interested to kind of get your perspective as we get into this conversation today and some of our case studies. So really, really excited to have you here, Dara. And I wonder if we can just start off by talking a little bit about what you consider to be going from level 0 to 1.
Yeah, totally. So when I think about like going from level 0 to level 1 in an organization, that's really the place where I feel the most passionate about bringing in data analytics. And what that really looks like is a lot of folks, when they think about bringing in data analytics to an organization, they think about machine learning, they think about bringing in the cloud, setting up AWS architecture, some really exciting initiatives that are happening in lots and lots of organizations that benefit those organizations by quite a bit. But the place where I really love to work is in those places where you're taking a team or an organization from level 0, which is maybe they don't have data, maybe they don't consider themselves data people, maybe the execs don't typically make decisions based on data, they make decisions based on anecdotes or lived experience, which is valuable, but a little bit different. Taking those kinds of organizations and teams to level 1, where we're incorporating a little bit of a cultural shift. Folks are starting to get used to reading data, learning about averages and percentages, making decisions based on that data. You'll have to excuse my puppy if you can hear him in the background. Kind of developing that baseline data literacy and also executing that kind of cultural transformation where teams are starting to leverage data in their everyday processes rather than sort of using anecdotes or tribal knowledge or lived experience.
So would we say that maybe a level 0 could also be an organization that is using some data, like in Excel?
Totally. Yeah, that's a really great point. And one thing that I've seen in some teams, I think oftentimes these are actually in finance teams where you're kind of required to use data. It's part of your job, but maybe what that looks like is working with Excel spreadsheets. You're not necessarily aggregating that data. You're kind of looking through rows and columns. And it takes a very specific, special kind of person to be able to work effectively in that space. You have to have a lot of an analytical background, the ability to, read through rows and columns and infer information. This is one reason why I really love data visualization so much, is it can kind of democratize the useful insights that are locked into those sort of zeros and ones or rows and columns, make it usable to multiple people rather than relying on, the one financial analyst who knows how to use the complicated spreadsheet.
Yeah, absolutely. No, okay, cool. So we're coming into an organization. They don't have sort of a culture or a lot of structure around using data in their decision-making processes, right? Where do you start?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that's an area where you really need to make sure that you have a good strategy. If a team or an organization doesn't know what they're trying to achieve in general as a business or with their data, it's going to get kind of messy. You're going to start working on random projects.
Mhm.
You might not see the ROI that you're looking for. So we often start with a question of what are we trying to achieve? What's the business imperative here, and what does success look like? So for a sales organization or a sales team, that might be we want to increase our revenue, we want to increase our profits, something like that. If you're in healthcare, it might be you want to decrease your cost or utilization, that sort of thing. Um, and that oftentimes, when you put that into a sentence, that gives you a good direction for what you might want to measure. So you want to increase profits and revenue. Maybe that's a good start, is automating some self-service ability for everybody in the company to look into the data around that company's profits and revenue, for example. Oftentimes, the sort of core strategy or core business imperative of an organization is the thing that I think in a level one organization, most people in the organization should know some data about that. So, if you are a customer facing organization, most people in the organization should know like how many customers you have and what kind of revenue that represents, that sort of thing. With everybody able to sort of speak that same language, you're way better at making those decisions based on that data.
So, but right there, we're kind of already um, at level one when people know what customers are and what revenues are and what
Hmm.
sort of average customer value might be and things like that. Um, there's already some data literacy there, right? So typically, and I'm making some assumptions here, so correct
Hmm.
me if I'm wrong, but typically when we first dig in to that business problem or imperative and we say, okay, we want to start measuring profits and we start looking at the data as an analyst, you start to see um, guardrails that you need to define, right? That
Hmm.
you start to see the definitions that you need to actually make, right? Like in your queries or whatever tools you're using, you need to say, this is what I'm going to consider as revenue, this is what I'm going to consider as cost, and therefore this is what profit is, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So once you've made that decision as an analyst, how do you share and generate that literacy throughout the organization at a level zero?
Yeah, and so you bring up a really good point, which is the critical role the analyst has in defining those guardrails. And I think this is one very exciting piece of the art and science of being an analyst, which is learning what your executives and the business actually considers to be those guardrails, but maybe they aren't saying that.
Mhm.
So there's kind of an art to having those conversations up front with executives to learn, okay, when you say profits, what exactly are you talking about? Can you explain that to me like I'm five? What's considered profits and what's considered other money that maybe gets excluded, that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
then you can impose those guardrails in a way that's close enough to the way the most important people or most people might consider those metrics to be defined as. And then to your point of translating that information back to an organization, not just the executive who's defining it, but everybody else, and teaching everybody sort of what that metric means and how to make decisions based off of it. It's almost the reverse art and science of how do you take this number, maybe it's profits or some percentage or some rate of change, and use that in a very understandable context. Again, this is where data visualization can be super helpful. If you just see a number, a big dollar amount, it's kind of hard to know, is that
Mhm.
good? Is that bad? But if you see, the profit line is going up, that's a pretty easy thing to understand. So data visualization, a huge piece of that toolbox. I also very frequently employ the, explain like I'm five style of putting numbers into context. So the way I tend to think about it is if I can't use this number in a sentence that doesn't involve any arithmetic in it, like I'm not just defining what the metric is, if I can't use it in a sentence, that a regular person would understand, then it's not a very good metric, because when people think about data and they use it to make business decisions, they're kind of turning it into a sentence in their head. And you want it to be a sentence that is pretty standardized across everyone, or else, people are inferring different things. It gets really messy.
Yeah. So I love the idea of explain it to me like I'm five, right? So, because I think actually it takes a bit of confidence to be able to say that. Like, I feel like we need to
Hmm.
break through imposter syndrome and not feel like worried that the executive across the table is going to think we're an idiot if we say like we don't understand what profit is, right? So,
Yep,
because we
exactly.
generally speaking, but we want to make sure that we understand what they mean so that we don't have to come back 50 times when we're in the database or whatever structure we're in, right? So what advice would you have to people who are maybe just starting out, or maybe even are later in their careers but have started at a new organization and are having these conversations and maybe are nervous to do that?
That's a really great question. So, that there is a little bit of finesse to having those conversations for sure, especially because oftentimes as an analyst, and maybe slightly more often as a woman in analytics, folks kind of want to test you a little bit. They want to make sure you really know what you're doing before they send you off to go do the thing. Um, One way that I find helpful to frame up those questions is to start out by making some assumptions. Maybe define the metric the way that you personally would define it, or the way that you've seen it defined in other businesses you've worked in, or in other businesses you've seen. And then make sure that you outline all of those assumptions to the executive. So, say we're defining, the average cost of a hospitalization, something like that. So we're looking to find the average cost, and the cost includes, the room, the cost includes the equipment used, et cetera, et cetera. It does not include X, Y, and Z. Here's how I'm defining average cost of a hospitalization as an analyst, and I would ask the executive to look through that list and say, oh, this isn't right, this is right. So that achieves a couple of things. Number one, it demonstrates that you kind of know what you're doing, like you know what's involved in a hospitalization, you have some subject matter expertise, uh, you're used to developing metrics, and it also gives them something to react to, where rather than having them sort of come up with this stuff in their heads, where maybe they're so used to thinking about hospitalizations that it's like second nature to them. Of course it wouldn't include X, Y, and Z. Rather than that, where maybe they'll miss some things in their definition to you, um, they can kind of react to what you're specifying as your assumptions, and then they can say, oh wait, this one looks wrong, it should be this other thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. To be honest, I actually had no self-awareness around that tactic until you just verbalized it. So that's really cool that you already do have that, because I think you're right. It establishes a baseline of capability, of thought process. It invites them to the table without putting too much onus. I think it's awesome. So that's great advice. And for those of you who haven't had to learn this on your own yet, you're welcome. So from Dara. Um, but I'm glad that we went the hospitalization route and we brought up the woman route as well. So I want to dive into both of those really quickly. But let's take the hospitalization first, because with your background and public health and so forth, I'm wondering if you can give us sort of a more concrete example of what you're talking about potentially within the hospitalization system right now.
Yeah, totally. So, kind of a more specific example of an organization going from 0 to 1. I think one that we've all sort of seen, in this whole country basically, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think it's a great example of going from a place where you don't really know what's going on, you're not making decisions based on data yet, to going to a level 1 arena where you kind of know what's normal, what's not normal, you're collecting some data, it's pretty accessible to folks. You may or may not be doing some advanced analytics. Um, so kind of starting out, if we think back to, say, March 2020, which feels super long ago at this point, uh, we were starting to hear about COVID cases in the ones and twos. Every day the news would tell us, okay, now we're up to 10 COVID cases in the United States. Okay, now we're up to 100 COVID cases in the United States. You're really just counting at that point. You're at that point. You might as well be looking at a spreadsheet. You can outline 1 case, 2 case, 3 case. You can count it on your fingers, and that's totally fine. And then as the pandemic starts to evolve, we need to start figuring out some slightly more sophisticated ways of measuring what's going on and whether it's good. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Those quickly became very important questions for many government organizations and nationally. Lots and lots of companies were trying to figure out what to do. Should we shut down offices, et cetera? And so at that point, we're at sort of a baseline level of data literacy, or we're starting to get at a baseline level of data literacy where folks know what COVID is, folks know what a case is mostly, they know how many cases we've had in the United States. And then to layer on that extra question of, are things getting better? Are things getting worse? We needed to implement some slightly more complex metrics, like how many cases did we have today versus yesterday, rather than just the running total of how many we've ever had. We started running into some questions of, are cases related to the number of tests that are being conducted? Are we just seeing more cases because we're testing more? And that starts to introduce some slightly more interesting metrics around, say, test positivity. So if we're testing more and cases are going up, we probably want the percentage of those tests that are positive to stay pretty low. And so we started to, as a nation, as the New York Times, the CDC, Johns Hopkins had a dashboard. Everybody's looking at these metrics, and you can kind of see nationally this shift in thinking from, okay, we have 10 cases, we've had 100 cases so far. We've seen this shift from the running total to something slightly more nuanced, like test positivity, or how has the number of cases today changed compared to the number of cases yesterday or the number of cases last week. So it's a really great case study in seeing not an organization, but kind of a nation go from level 0 to level 1, where you're kind of learning a little bit about the nuances of what you're measuring. You're developing a little bit more sophistication in how to tell whether things are going well or going poorly. And then you're kind of iterating on your metrics from there.
Yes, it would be a very interesting case study to look at overall, because I do wonder, I agree. I think that if you have been really watching the metrics, we did go from counting to kind of analyzing over maybe a period of, I'm struggling to remember, but I feel like looking back, it was maybe within the first 6 weeks, we kind of made that migration from like the aggregate to the rate of change, to the growth rate of cases. And that was interesting because there's the flatten the curve campaign, but there was never really any definition around what flattening meant, right?
Totally.
And so, but I would argue that there's still kind of the sensationalist, or not even argue, I would just point out and be interested, if we were to study this later, like how many headlines were still only about the aggregates, as opposed to like some of these more nuanced metrics. And yeah,
absolutely. And I would say it's also been very illuminating for me as an analyst to see how these numbers get represented in the news. It's a great example of the explain like I'm 5, use it in a sentence approach, being a very good indicator of whether somebody knows or does not know what exactly they're talking about. Things that are as simple as rate of change. You might want to say, okay, we've had this number of new cases. How does that compare to 2 weeks ago? Yeah. There are actually so many nuances in how you can measure that, and they make a pretty big difference. You can compare today to the exact same day 2 weeks ago, which has a whole bundle of challenges because, of course, the days, there's lots of spikes in day-to-day new cases. You can compare the average of this week to the average of the week 2 weeks ago, et cetera. There are so many iterations of comparing right now to 2 weeks ago. And I think different places are doing them differently, and you can kind of tell which organizations uh, are being really careful and sophisticated about how they're defining their metrics, um, by how easily they can use them in the sentence.
I think you also bring up a good point with the choosing the day, right? Because this one is one that is just driven me bonkers since we started tracking daily case counts. I think it's interesting from the standpoint of like within your own organization, how much conviction to have around when and how often you want to report, right? Because if you
Mm-hmm.
think about COVID, right, like the world has been watching. So in the media's defense, like they've felt the pressure and also these healthcare organizations, whether it's the CDC or Johns Hopkins, they felt this sort of pressure, like, we have to give daily stats. But the reality is that just like the rest of the world, like people can't work 24/7 at these places. So we would always see a lag after the weekend in reporting numbers. And then on Tuesdays, they'd always spike because that was
Mm-hmm.
when the processing had happened off the data. And so, but if you're not paying attention, because who on earth, if they're working from home and they have kids at home and like can actually notice that, oh yeah, this is always on Tuesdays, like I shouldn't worry about it. So if
Totally.
you're in your organization and you have a similar cyclical, like for whatever reason, there's like something in your data pipeline that means that like if you report on Tuesdays, you're always going to see spikes. Then maybe you should talk to your group or your seniors about saying like, actually, I really think that we should only always report on Wednesdays or Fridays for something that's not going to have so much volatility, that's not real. It's just a representation of how the pipeline is working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings up a really good point that I'm seeing also in the COVID reporting, which is using a 7-day average rather than using daily case counts.
Mhm.
While like daily case count being above 100,000 in the US, it makes the headline. It's a great one-liner. Uh, when it comes to trends and how things are going or not going, I see a lot of news organizations changing to a 7-day moving average. So you're looking at the average of the last 7 days or the total cases in the last 7 days. And you're kind of comparing that to what was the 7-day average the day before, which helps to smooth out a lot of that up and down of maybe hospitals don't report until Monday because people aren't working as much over the weekend. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to dig into there. I think maybe we should, at the risk of exhausting everyone who's already probably exhausted by this whole year, maybe we should move on to talking about another topic that's actually been heavy this year on diversity. So you mentioned a little bit earlier on when we were talking about, having those conversations with executives that sometimes you can feel more tested as a woman. And to be honest, I would agree with that. I think that those conversations can look really different. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your experience as a woman and what you think could help others kind of combat some of the issues that you've already felt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of blog posts by women in tech and women in analytics that outline some of the challenges of working as a woman in a relatively male dominated field. I've definitely felt many of those. The example of uh, being tested. You're walking into a boardroom and they go, oh, you know data analytics, well, tell me all of the statistical models in the world. That sort of thing totally happens. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that type of thing very frequently happens. Even working with like a male dominated technical team, that's very frequent, where they kind of want to get a sense of, does she actually know what she's talking about. um, Definitely have felt a lot of that. For me, I think the one of the most beneficial learnings that I've had from working in the analytics field as a woman and working in lots of male dominated teams is really the importance of having good role models and finding good mentorship. For me, it means not only finding other women in analytics and kind of learning from them what kinds of strategies they employ, but also finding role models who work in the same way that you do. They have kind of similar business personalities to you. Um, so to be a little bit more concrete, I personally have a relatively like mild personality. I'm not the most, assertive, dominating person in the room. Lots of advice to women in male dominated fields talk about, being a little more assertive, standing up straight, all of which is valuable and relevant, but some of it just doesn't feel authentic to me. So what I've felt to be very, very useful in sort of finding my voice and finding my authenticity in especially a male dominated room, but in any room really, is finding role models who work really effectively, who have similar personalities to me. So uh, and those have been both men and women. So finding the executive who their voice maybe doesn't project quite as loudly as anybody else in the room, but they're still able to be really effective, really studying those people and getting a sense of, okay, how do they make their voice heard in that room when other people are talking over them? And then starting to try out those strategies and seeing which ones feel authentic and effective for me has been super, super helpful. And I think the piece around your role model not necessarily having to be a woman, for me, that's been super helpful, especially in organizations where there aren't necessarily woman role models. Like it's so male dominated that I'm truly the only woman in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think both of those points are really, really strong, right? Like, I think there's probably not one narrative for like any group or like for any one person, right? That's gonna resonate. But like that level of macro thinking probably just can't apply. But I've never really thought about it from that lens of personality traits. I have to admit that it's definitely some things have resonated with me and some things
Yeah.
it's been like, no, I'm never gonna do that.
Yep.
But I think that that the male, like allowing yourself to have a male role model, I think is great too. Because look, like I mean, I don't know. In my opinion, it's not it doesn't matter about and women are great, and there should be a woman-dominated field. It's not that. It's just that sometimes it can be a little bit uncomfortable
Mhm.
because you're not, you don't know what people are thinking about you, and it seems like their past experiences are mapping some thoughts and biases onto you, and that
Oh,
can
absolutely.
uncomfortable, right? But the reality is that there are lots of different ways to cut an onion. Is that a saying? I don't know. Crumble a cookie, something.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a
Yeah.
thing.
And I think that finding the one that you think will work best for you and will be the way that you ultimately want to be represented is awesome. I really love that. Um, how like if you are in a small organization and I remember being asked when I was a kid, like, who's your idol? And I really kind of really struggled.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
everyone had these like, athletes and like the president, and I was like, I don't know. Do you have any advice for people who don't really have like people that they look up to in their immediate surrounding, like how they would go and find someone that they feel is representative and they'd like to be like?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good question. And there have been many times where I've looked around myself in, the team meeting or in the executive meeting and uh, realized like, oh, these people are a little different from me, or I don't really see myself in any of these people, either because none of them are women, which is very frequent, or they all have slightly different personalities from me, which is also pretty frequent. And I would say that my best strategy in those scenarios is to not necessarily look for the whole package in one person. It's going to be kind of tough sometimes to find a person who you really feel that kindred spirit with, and you can see yourself being them in 5 years, and that's what you want to do. Um, it's a little bit easier in those situations, in my experience, to look around you and see what qualities people have that you really admire and could see yourself emulating. So, maybe this COO that you're sitting next to, isn't a woman, probably, in this day and age, isn't a woman, maybe is a little bit different in their style of leadership or in the way they think. Maybe they're not as analytically minded as you, but you really like the way that they talk to people one on one and really listen to the other person's point of view. So you can kind of think about wanting to emulate that particular feature or that particular quality in a person and start studying and asking them advice about, okay, I really like the way you relate to your direct reports. I really like the way you collaborate with other people in the C-suite. Uh, can you give me some advice on this particular scenario where I'm going to have to do that? I
Mhm.
think you can learn a lot by kind of isolating the qualities that you would like to emulate, rather than necessarily looking for like the whole package in one person.
So I also think that that's a great way to develop a mentorship, right? Like if you identify the specific thing, I don't know how if you've ever heard of Michael Lasso, but I love his framework, some of his frameworks that he applies to life, and one of them is the best kind of feedback is truthful, specific, and positive.
Hmm.
TSP. And I'll have to tag Michael in this episode. But the specificity is really what kind of resonates with us. So if you find that person and you're like, hey, I love your listening skills, like I would love to talk to you a little bit more about that, then all of a sudden that changes from like just in sort of a role model relationship to potentially a mentor, at least conversation. Because I think that also when we talk about developing mentors relationships and so forth, it becomes this thing where it's like, oh, okay, so I have to find someone or I have to enroll in a program and it has to be 6 months or
Hmm.
12 months and I have to, it doesn't, in my opinion, I don't know about yours, it doesn't have to be that prescriptive. It can be maybe just those conversations, especially if you can identify that specific thing that you want to emulate and you really respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other benefits of that approach to finding mentorship and finding qualities you want to emulate in a person, that kind of goes back to the challenges of being the only woman in the room, is if you can build those relationships with folks based on, hey, I really like the way you speak up in meetings, I like the way you articulate your thoughts, can you give me some advice on how to do that, for example. um, that also kind of inherently builds allies in the room with you. So the COO who's in the next meeting with you, who you've just talked to about how you're trying to become more outspoken, you're trying to get better at making your voice heard, that person is maybe a little bit more likely to raise their hand and say, hey, I'd really like to know what Dara would like to say. It sounds like she has some really good ideas. Having those relationships going into a room, going into an important meeting is super, super helpful in my experience, for, having my voice heard and kind of getting my point across.
Absolutely. So speaking of being in the room, and especially, again, the first time, it doesn't have to be when you're early in your career. It can be the first time that you're in a room at a new organization, which,
Hmm.
there's been a lot of job shift over the past 6 or 7, I don't even know how many months we are into this thing, to be honest anymore. But there's been a lot of that. And I think that coming into these rooms, and especially virtually when you haven't had the benefit of meeting people for the first time, feeling deserving to be there and walking that line of not wanting to say too much right off the bat because you might seem sort of too outspoken or like you're trying to defend yourself already, or
Hmm.
versus saying too much because you are trying to do those things. Like how do you what do you have anything to say about sort of that feeling of deserving and how to mm, how to get it basically.
Yeah, yeah, I have so much to say about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, an area of kind of working in businesses that I find really interesting, is sort of the meeting dynamic or the dynamic of being in a room. In part because me, with my style of working and my personality, it can be kind of a challenge. Not everybody is a group discussion expert right off the bat. And especially when you're new to an organization, or you stick out in some way, like you're the only woman in the room, or you're obviously the youngest or the oldest person in the room, it can feel a little weird to speak up. um, and I think some of that comes from imposter syndrome. I think it's worth noting that, like, you might go into a room on the assumption that everybody in the room knows more than you about what they're talking about, and it is surprising how often that is not true. So I think a couple of very concrete strategies that I find myself employing a lot and also advising, my direct reports or other people on my team who have similar challenges to employ are number one, if you're in a room where everybody's talking about something and you feel like you're not the expert and everybody else is, or you feel like you don't know quite as much, maybe you're onboarding. One way to very easily add value is to kind of restate what's going on in the room, kind of synthesize what the conversation is in, again, it's kind of like the explain like I'm five, synthesize what's going on in like one or two sentences, in part for your understanding, but almost always also for everybody else's understanding. Oftentimes conversations can go in all sorts of different directions. Two people are talking about decisions being made in completely different directions, and they both think that they're the ones that are correct at that point. So being the person to add clarity as the conversation gets complicated and you don't really know where we're headed is super helpful. Oftentimes I find that many people don't naturally have the instinct to do that. It's super helpful for everybody in the room because coming out of the conversation, everybody has a shared understanding. Again, it gives the room something to react to. So if you synthesize the conversation and it's not actually correct, and everybody says, "Oh, actually, that's not where we're headed. We're headed in this direction." Now you know, and then also maybe other people in the room didn't have that same understanding. So it's really helpful to use that strategy of just synthesizing what's going on in the room. It's a great way to add value if you might not necessarily have some subject matter expertise to add. Another area that I think is super helpful in a similar vein is just asking for clarity.
Mm.
So for example, and again, I would use a similar strategy as the one that we talked about with obtaining metrics definitions from an executive, which is, you say, "Hey, Kaylee, I hear you say maybe we should do X, Y, and Z. Does that mean that we shouldn't do A, B, and C, or are you talking in addition to?" Questions like that um, show that you're following and understanding, but also you're really thinking critically about what it would look like to do whatever they're talking about or what the implications would be. I think those are super helpful.
And I think whether it's with the reframing or the clarification, I feel like as analysts or people in the analytical space, we're actually really uniquely positioned to do that because we have to be scoping and reading the field, typically with numbers, but also just with business problems on a very regular, constant basis. Versus the rest, typically the rest of an organization has sort of their functional area that they're trying to understand really in depth. Whereas if you're the person who's tasked with looking across, that is a value that you can bring that you bring. And I think that a couple of things about that. One, when we have these conversations around like being a woman in the realm, we're talking about imposter syndrome or sort of these more like self-development-y things. It can feel a little bit like selfish
Mm-hmm.
or like not real work, right? But I think that some of that groundwork is really what enables you to come into that room, have the confidence and the knowledge of what you actually bring to that table, and therefore you actually are more. I fuzzed out. Sorry. I don't know what happened. Whatever. All right, I'm buzzing. That's fine. Do it. So, and then you actually are, you actually contribute a lot more because you took that 5 or 10 minutes to listen to that podcast or do that, journaling or whatever it was to figure out what you really do feel like you bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that I would just add on to that, that I've found very helpful when I think about, is my taking up space or having a voice or contributing X, Y, and Z to a conversation, is that like a selfish
Mm,
thing? Like, am I just wanting to make my voice heard or be the loudest person in the room? One thing that I find super helpful to consider, especially as a woman in the room, or whatever the quality is that you think you feel kind of nervous about because it makes you stick out, maybe you're the youngest or the oldest, is the fact that you're also setting an example for anybody else who might also be in the room and feeling kind of awkward about it. The number of times I've been in a room with exactly one other woman, and that woman is so awesome and outspoken and articulate and makes really good points, and my jaw is on the floor. It just really fuels my desire to, when I'm in the room with somebody else who maybe is a little bit more reserved, or a woman who's earlier career, it really fuels my desire to be that woman who I admired in the prior meeting and kind of demonstrate that, oh, this is what this can look like.
That's awesome. I love that reminder. That's a really good reminder. And I'm so fuzzy. Sorry. All right, so we are almost out of time with you, but if you could just close us off with any advice you have for people on thinking analytically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm going to go, as I do, super simple, super concrete. Like, this is a very easy strategy to employ anytime you're doing anything with data or metrics. One thing that I see super frequently is, especially with folks who are not originally from analytics backgrounds, is they say, I want to see X, Y, and Z metrics. I want to see cost, profit, revenue, these 3 metrics. And then as an analyst, the obvious next question that should be everybody's obvious next question is compared to what? So you can see the big number, maybe hospital price of a hospitalization. I want to see price of a hospitalization, and maybe it's $100,000. Okay, that's a really big number. Is that like high? Is that bad? Is that low? Are we getting
Yeah.
better? So always ask as your second question, or in your definition as your second sentence, consider what you're comparing to. So that can be time. Are you doing better or worse than this time last week, this time last year? It can be compared to benchmarks. How are we doing compared to our peers in the industry? How are we doing compared to other teams who are doing similar work? It can be compared to other types of customers. Just always consider what the context is, because without it, you're just going to have a number and it won't be as useful.
Yeah, I think that's super, super, super important in any number that you're looking at, especially in some of these macro trends that we've been talking about. I think that was one of the really difficult things with the COVID numbers in the beginning, and to an extent still today, with a lot of the diversity metrics that we're trying to create now as we start to try to define that world more, which is a great effort, but I think also one that makes it difficult in terms of the comparison point. Yeah, fantastic advice. Dara, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all the insights that you've given to everyone on the call today, and would really look forward to speaking again sometime.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Kaylee. It's been great.
Okay, thanks everyone.